From the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, this is NATO 2020, a new podcast series pitching fresh ideas for the world's oldest military alliance. I'm your host, Terry Schultz. I'm a freelance journalist in Brussels, and I've covered NATO for more than a decade. So I know a lot about how the alliance has been doing things, but this podcast is about how it could be doing things differently. The Atlantic Council commissioned a series of 20 recommendations as to how the 70-year-old alliance could freshen up a bit heading into the next decade. Some of these are ideas we've heard before, and some are brand new. All of them are aimed at making NATO more resilient and responsive to the threats that indeed get more creative all the time. So I'm going to be digging into those ideas with their authors. In this episode, the recommendation is modernize the kit and the message. The author, Her Excellency, Dame Karen Pierce, the current British ambassador to Washington. Thank you so much for joining us, Ambassador.
It's great to see you. Thanks for having me.
So I'm going to get started with the very title of your essay, and that is modernizing the message. So you've been around. You've been with the United Nations in both New York and Geneva. You've been the UK's ambassador to Afghanistan. So you have a lot of experience with how NATO is viewed outside the alliance, outside allied territory. So when you talk about modernizing the message, who do you think is NATO's audience these days? Is it trying to win friends or scare enemies or both? And what should be its message and how do you modernize it?
I think it's definitely trying to communicate to its own people. Why do we do the things we do? Why is collective security still necessary? How is collective security, as represented by NATO, as you said, the oldest military alliance, how is that going to help deal with all the new threats like cyber and things like that? Then rather than scare enemies, Terry, I think I'd say it's putting enemies on notice. Don't mess with us. Don't tread on us, to employ an American phrase. We are ready. We have modernized in our eastern flank. It's sending a message to people like Russia and China who want to have a competition to set the rules of international affairs. It's sending a good message about collective action, a good message about alliances, but it's also making sure its capabilities are strong in the real world. And then I think it's saying to the rest of the world, the UN and others, NATO is a presence and we're ready to help with some of these big new challenges. NATO's done peacekeeping with a UN Security Council mandate. I'm sure it will again. But fundamentally, NATO is ready to contribute to wider stability.
You talk about both the kit, the equipment, the capabilities, and the message. Do you think that they've kept up with modernizing the message as well and as quickly as they have with the capabilities? They moved so fast after Ukraine annexed Crimea, for example, to put in place the enhanced forward presence that you mentioned. So a lot of these things moved quickly, transforming the military side of it. But has the message side kept up?
Well, you'd know that better than me, probably. But, I used to work on NATO issues. I once held the distinction of being the only person who'd been to all of the working groups on arms control back in the 1990s. And indeed, and you have acronyms coming out of your ears. And to be absolutely honest, you take a perverse pride in knowing what all these acronyms are. But my guess is that for people who don't live and breathe this stuff, the message bears repeating, and it bears repeating in very clear language. NATO makes a huge contribution to all of our security through Article 5, and it may be that all these cyber attacks that we see from places like Russia, but not just Russia, these cyber attacks will one day come to be as dangerous and as threatening as an armed attack. And I know the Alliance has actually agreed that in certain circumstances, cyber attacks would invoke the collective security Article 5, where all the allies come to help the person under attack. But I think one can always improve the message. I think publics need to know what their taxpayers' dollars or euros or pounds have been spent on. They need to know that we can keep people safe and that we put a lot of effort into making sure our capabilities are as good as anyone else's. But I mean, you know better than me, Terry, there's always scope for a simpler message.
With no acronyms. That's
I'm
a
sorry?
journalist with no acronyms. Journalists
With no
are always
acronyms.
trying to get acronyms out of their articles.
Absolutely, absolutely. We try and ban them from all our cables. We
Good
very
job.
rarely succeed.
That's true. So you mentioned Russia, and your paper does talk a lot about Russia as obviously one of the biggest threats that NATO has to deal with. And you mentioned specifically the Skripal and now the Navalny poisonings, and you call this something little short of gangsterism on the part of the Kremlin. And you mentioned that the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, which you will know well, have a special duty to uphold international law on the prohibited use of chemical weapons, like, of course, Novichok. But, Ambassador, how do you do that when one of the 5 is Russia?
I think that's a really good question. I think it's a fundamental conundrum, to be honest. I remember working on the Balkans, working with NATO back in the 1990s. And at the time, Russia joined NATO in the peacekeeping operation in the Balkans. They joined what was then the Stabilization Force, S4. They had an office not just at NATO HQ, but at Mons, where the military side of NATO is. What has happened to Russia that she has taken herself out of these cooperative arrangements? And I haven't yet found a good answer from the Russians on that. I think just since the 1990s, since the 2000s, Russia has just been getting more aggressive, more disruptive, less inclined to join the international community. Some of that, I think, is the competition you mentioned earlier. Some of it is something a little bit harder edge, possibly a little bit nastier. For our part, we would really like to have a productive relationship with Russia. We've had one before. We have a very long history with Russia, much of it very good. We greatly admire the Russian people, and we were allies in the Second World War. So I think really the question is for Russia, why won't you come in and be cooperative with the UN Security Council, if not with NATO? You know, we understand Russia has a certain amount of fear of NATO, suspicion of NATO, but the Security Council's not like that. And Russia has this privileged position, as do we, in the Security Council. So why not work to uphold what the Security Council decides?
Well, in this case, if you're talking about poisonings that were clearly, in the view of the international community, committed by Russia, how is there any hope that they're going to uphold those standards? I mean, they're also members of the OPCW. I mean, it's not the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. Look what I did. I used an acronym.
Yeah, look what you did. Exactly.
We can't avoid it.
It gets you every time. Yeah.
What do you do? Doesn't that make you ineffective? I mean, there's no message that's going to change the sort of moribund nature of that the Security Council finds itself in so often.
I think it's certainly true that because of Russian behavior and to a certain extent Chinese behavior, the Security Council decisions are less well respected around the world than they were. You know, you see the Russians and Chinese doing sanctions busting on North Korea. You see them condoning the use of chemical weapons in Syria. You see Russia conducting these airstrikes and supporting Syrian airstrikes over Idlib, which is a humanitarian disaster. And you don't see the Security Council decisions being respected. That's not to say the Security Council cannot act. There are other areas where Security Council has been able to take decisions. So I don't want to say it's a universal problem, but it seems to be on the most acute problems that we face. We have a big problem because of Russia's desire to undermine international unity and, if you like, the Western approach to values. And I think that's a pity. I think we've got to go on holding out the opportunity for Russia to join, got to go on continuing to talk to China, who aids and abets Russia in very many ways
We'll get
on
to
these
them.
issues. Yeah, and making clear that the rest of the world really doesn't believe chemical weapons should be used. So why is Russia putting herself on the wrong side of history?
And, speaking of messaging, NATO came out quite strongly and quite quickly after the Navalny poisoning and held a North Atlantic Council meeting and came out condemning the Navalny poisoning in a faster, in a faster reaction than we've often seen from NATO. So maybe they read your essay. Another question on messaging for NATO versus Russia. I mean, not only does Russia have the advantage when you're talking about movements, because of course they don't have to ask any other government's opinion about whether they should, launch this operation or that. But when it comes to messaging, it's the same thing. We see so often at NATO that the issue starts out very strong, but by the time you need 30 governments' approval, what comes out at the end of the day after we journalists have been waiting for it for hours and hours and hours and hours, it sounds very bland. I mean, sometimes you can't even get countries to agree to use the word condemn on something that, is a pretty terrible action. So how can a 30 government alliance ever make such a strong statement as a government which can say anything it wants with, no need for consensus? I mean, I understand that, and you could say that just having 30 governments say anything is a powerful statement, but I knew it. I knew you were gonna try that on me. But does it sound as strong to Russia? I mean, do you think so?
Oh, I don't think the Russians take any notice, to be honest, of what we say in public. But they do notice how many people sign up, because that in some ways undercuts their power with their own people. It undercuts them in the United Nations. It undercuts them in the Chemical Weapons Organization and in the OSCE, which is the Euro-Atlantic Security Cooperative Forum. So I think they do notice that, and I think it does have an effect. At the same time, you're absolutely right. It can be very difficult to get 30 governments to sign up. What I would say on that, though, Terry, is I actually think NATO is pretty good at it. If you've laboured away in the General Assembly, in the United Nations, or even in the Security Council, which is half the membership size of NATO, then I actually think NATO is pretty good. I think the Secretary General is particularly good at communicating messages, at getting the story out, getting the narrative out, explaining why good works in one way and bad works in another. I've been impressed by that. And I think NATO has this nice arrangement where it works on consensus. Now, you could say consensus is just another word for unanimity, but it does seem to induce a different sort of spirit for people round the table. The last thing I'd say on this particular point, we've been talking about NATO as if it's only a military alliance. Actually, fundamentally, it's a political alliance. It's a political military alliance. The North Atlantic Council is where the political diplomatic decisions get made, and then the military flows from that. And I think that's also a huge strength for things like this.
We definitely need both sides of it. And then you have to get the finance ministers to pay for it.
Oh, well, you always have to get the finance ministers to pay for things.
So you've talked a lot about Russia, but let's also talk about China a little bit more, which you do in your essay, and we've done a little bit of here. You said that NATO allies need to be very aware that state adversaries will use technology, will potentially use technology to help malign non-state actors. And you say this specifically with regard to the Chinese government. Are you referring specifically to Huawei, which the UK government has now banned from its 5G systems? Other European governments are looking at making that same decision. Do you think that's really important for NATO allies to be able to keep their systems safe and secure?
I think it's absolutely important to keep systems safe and secure, because if there were to be any crisis, NATO internal communications, intelligence communications would be incredibly important. In the article, I was trying to draw attention to two things. One is there is a risk that non-state actors who are malign get access to this technology, not necessarily that the Chinese would give it to them, though I can think of some countries that would use non-state actors as proxies. And then there's a risk, of course, that AI, cyber are used as offensive weapons, if you like, against NATO countries. With Huawei, the issue was that Huawei were never allowed into the innermost core of UK secret national security communications, but they were to have been in the outer edge. However, when the Americans banned American components being used in Huawei products, we came to the conclusion that we couldn't vouch for the integrity of those products, and therefore we had to ban them from what we call the outer edge as well. The real problem, of course, is that there's a market failure. There were only 3 companies in the world that could provide 5G technology, and I think one of the things we must all do after COVID is make sure we don't fall behind in the technological race. Now, NATO is not a commercial organization, but it can certainly help create the context where allies collaborate on this new technology.
Well, this has certainly come up at NATO quite a bit, the question of Huawei, because of the pressure the United States is putting on European allies. And that's not going away anytime soon. And the EU has also joined in and of course, as you know, and urged the Europeans to figure out if they believe they can completely block any attempt by the Chinese government to get information. And that seems to be an ongoing process, and the UK being one of the governments inside NATO, which has already made a clear decision. Do you think that China will continue to grow also on NATO's list of challenges to worry about? The Secretary General is always very careful to say that NATO doesn't view China as a military threat, but it's clear that with buying up the ports and the airports and other key assets, that China is something to worry about in case, push comes to shove in a conflict.
I think it's definitely a competitor, a strategic competitor, and that if NATO, even if NATO doesn't view it as a military threat now, it's obviously something to watch, and it's obviously something to watch Chinese capabilities. I remember when I was working on NATO issues, being told by my boss that the most important thing was capabilities, not intentions, which is also quite a good signifier. And there are areas of the world where China is really contesting not so much Western dominance, so much as Western values. And all the investment in Africa, what China does in the South China Seas, her human rights track record, these are all things we need to watch very carefully and be ready to deal with. I ought to say at the same time, we do want a proper economic relationship with China, but that needs to be a relationship built on commerce, built on China playing by the rules, and built around the Chinese companies we do business with not being instruments of the Chinese Communist Party, which was the big problem with Huawei.
And it could be with many other Chinese companies as well. If the Chinese government orders them to hand over data, they have much fewer powers than a company in the US or the UK or another European country would have to resist that.
Definitely. I know. I think that's exactly right. We have to be aware of that. The extent to which the Chinese Communist Party controls a lot of what happens, Chinese approach to investment in other countries. I think everybody would be better off if it were a freer, more commercial set of enterprises.
You mentioned also in your paper, in terms of modernizing, that the UK is looking at its capabilities and its resources, and is going to present a renewed sort of commitment to NATO. What does that mean exactly, and why is this needed, or is it just something that the UK unilaterally felt like it had to do, perhaps maybe Brexit has something to do with it, since NATO will become even more important to Britain after now that Brexit has happened, most of Brexit anyway.
I think NATO and the UN, to be honest, Terry, become bigger and more important stages for the UK to show that we're still an active, independent global player. The Foreign Secretary likes to talk in terms of force for good. So I'm going to echo that. And yes, we really want to play, we'll continue. We think we have a leading role in NATO at the moment. We'd like to continue that. We're going to put more money into research and development, including of weapons systems, for all the reasons we've just been talking about. I think actually as a whole, a lot of NATO allies are modernizing their defense forces. They're spending more money. More money isn't the only thing, of course. There's a whole range of things that allies can do to keep NATO as the premier alliance in the world. There's a 2% defense spending threshold that we aim for. We, the Brits, managed to exceed that. Only a handful of NATO allies do. But as I say, it isn't just the only thing we ought to be thinking about. There's cash, there's capabilities, there's commitments, reliability. All these things go to make up the NATO alliance. And I think we'll see a lot of interesting debate on how exactly we can bring those three things together as we move into the 2020s.
So to wrap up, you talk about NATO needing to communicate its positive message, and you've said here that you believe that they do a good job. And you don't have to say this, but I can say it, that one of the problems for NATO has been, at least as covered by us outside, has been that you have a very strong, heavily tweeted allied president tearing NATO down in many ways. And so it seems to me that it's hard to communicate a positive message when one of your own members is communicating a negative message often about the alliance. So you don't have to say anything about that, but I'm just wondering if you think that communicating a positive message will be easier now, that there's likely somebody who's going to say a lot of good things about NATO coming into the White House, or not that it's likely that he's coming, but it's likely that he'll say them. So is this going to be something, is NATO going to shine again? Is NATO going to be polished up again, you think, in terms of its image in the world?
I think NATO, I actually genuinely think NATO does a great job on modernization. It got the message early that you adapt to survive. And I think of all the international organizations, NATO has done one of the best in terms of doing that. And I think as we go forward with a new American administration, I think there will be more emphasis on what the allies can do together. I think one of the important things about communications is that the message has to make sense in each allied country. And I remember years ago when we were working on the Kosovo campaign, the NATO communications team actually had a member of each NATO ally in the center at NATO HQ, so that the message that was being put out made as much sense in Athens, say, as it did in Paris. And I do think that side of it is incredibly important, and focusing on the things that unite us, not divide us. That's a cliche, but it makes a lot of sense. And showing our peoples how NATO is modernizing to protect them against new threats. I think that's actually quite exciting. I think people are worried about the effect of new technology, and I think that's actually it's a very good reassurance thing for NATO to be able to tap into and explain what we're all doing.
Well, they can find it all in your essay, Modernize the Kit and the Message. Thank you very much, Ambassador, UK Ambassador to the United States, Dame Karen Pierce. Thanks for sharing your time with us and your ideas.
Thanks very much, Terry. Thank you for the questions. Bye-bye.
Bye. And for everyone else, you can find all 20 ideas at atlanticcouncil.org. Tell us what you think on Twitter at #StrongerWithAllies. And please join us next time.